So, oral narratives are important because they oppose Western ideals of language and literacy, and they build the Native American community up through solidarity in opposition to what was going to be forced on them, what is being forced on them. But you really could accomplish the same thing through written narratives, couldn't you? That's really the question that we're discussing right now, as we'll talk about how oral narratives lose communal meaning if they are translated, how oral narratives lose communal meaning if they are transcribed, and how performance is a critical element to oral narratives. All right, so oral narratives lose value if they're translated. This really can be most clearly seen in the video that I mentioned earlier with Andrew Begay, where he was talking about being brought up in the oral narrative tradition. And he says that one word in the original language really has as much meaning as a paragraph or perhaps an entire page in English. And this is because in the original language there's such depth of the meaning. There is so many implications in one word that says so much that it's very difficult to just transcribe when you're coming in as an outside language. To say all of that well and eloquently in a literary style is very difficult when you are translating these stories. You have to then, as the reader even, go to someone who speaks the original language and say, what does this mean? What does this passage indicate? What are the traditions behind this? How does this all work? It's very difficult to understand. Now, many oral narratives are being translated into English because more and more Native Americans are moving into urban environments and not growing up in their tribal languages. As a result, so that they can maintain this heritage and cultural tradition, the stories are translated so that they can participate in them. So there is still certainly value to translated oral narratives, but not necessarily as much meaning as is present in the original language. Oral narratives also lose meaning if they are transcribed or written down. Now, we're used to written stories in our culture. Stories told out loud is much more of a novelty and different. So you would assume that the written ones are best because that's what we're used to, but that's not necessarily true, and it's certainly not necessarily true for Native Americans who grew up in an oral culture. An example of this is just that oral narratives, if you write them down, they become automatically truncated somewhat or shortened and just changed just because they have to be edited to fit that format. In original oral narratives, you may have just a very repetitive elements. It's part of the cyclical style of Native American storytelling, is that you have these repeated elements that may be repeated 5 or 50 times. So when you're writing them down, well, the editor says, well, we really don't need to have that phrase for the 50th time. It could just be 48 times instead, or it could just be 3 times instead. So just by the very nature of what you're doing, even with no malice intended, you still have the stories changed and shortened in order to fit that format, and they no longer are the original stories. There was an introduction that I read about for a story which was transcribed. It was a Native American story, oral narrative, which was transcribed and written down by a Western editor. And the introduction to that story lauded the translator and transcriber of it, and it said specifically, these stories have simply been put into a familiar idiom with restraint and good taste, and in some cases purged of the incessant repetitions and cluttering details that primitive people often stuff into their stories for ulterior purposes. Now, that is obviously a very negative viewpoint, and there was obviously a bias that was approached when transcribing those stories. And when you have that bias, they will certainly be changed and they will lose their original value and meaning. But even when you don't approach it with malice, just the very constraints of the paper format requires that they must be changed. Another integral part of oral narratives is the performance aspect to them. The fact that these stories are spoken, that you hear the tones, that you see the gestures, that there is this very participating effect between the storyteller and the audience. Even if that's just mom telling a story to kids, there, or you have an elder, a storyteller telling it to the entire community, it's very much a performance. There was one tribe that I read about where if the storyteller stopped hearing regular feedback from his audience, where they would be regularly saying that's right and confirming what he was saying and speaking that they were listening or laughing at his story and what he was saying, he would simply stop and he wouldn't continue, because it's very much this balance between the performer and the audience. And you don't get that in the written format. You don't hear the tones, you don't hear the pauses, you don't hear the stresses, or any of that whole aspect of the performance, as well as the balance between audience and performer. So you really have to pay attention to that, and that's a large part of the reason why oral narratives are so important, and that they're spoken, and that there is a integral connection between the speaker, the audience, and us as a whole community. So oral narratives are important. In the Native American community, there is a creative power that is attached to words, a generative power. And that is not really as stressed in the written culture, and it's not really as stressed when these stories are changed from their original format, whether it be from losing their original language, or whether it be by changing them to being written, or just losing the performer who speaks with an audience in mind. As a result, it really is valuable that oral narratives are spoken. So, in my next video, I will discuss a specific oral narrative as an example of what I've been talking about so far, and just take that as an example that I hope you enjoy.